Hey guys, welcome back to Social Studies class in this next video lecture. Today I'm going to talk about the Spanish-American War and one of my favorite presidents, and really what we're looking at is the rise of the United States onto the world stage. Because before this war, the United States was mostly focused on its interactions in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas. They were busy spreading on our continent, and there was a doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine in the 1800s where the U.S. told Europe to stay out of South America's affairs, and that was their playground. But they hadn't really gone out into the rest of the world. They hadn't really interfered with the rest of the world. They hadn't really tried to spread beyond it, in part because the United States was too busy just building up the USA. So we're really looking at the point at which they come onto the world stage and they start acting aggressively and expansionistically and become a world power that has a say beyond just the Western Hemisphere. Also important for getting to the world wars. So, where does this begin? It begins with Teddy Roosevelt, one of my favorite, if not, well, my favorite American president. Vote Teddy 2020. Just kidding, he's dead. But he's a fascinating character and one who historians can't really nail down because he's complicated. So again, I asked this question: warmonger or peacemaker? Oh, killmonger. Anyway, warmonger or peacemaker? No, he didn't fight T'Challa. No, America did not invade Wakanda. That would be an amazing video, but that's not the video I'm making today. But he is complicated. He's a man who had sort of extreme thoughts and really pushed America forward. He could be very thoughtful, he could be very diplomatic, he could be very peacemaking, but he could also be very warlike at times, and that's what we're really going to look at here. So let's dig deeper. The peacemaker side is where I want to start. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, actually, for hosting the peace conference at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, which we will get to later. As sort of the last of these major wars before World War I. And at the end of that, Roosevelt invites the Japanese and the Russians to have the peace conference in America, and he brings them to the table, and he accomplishes peace, and the Nobel Prize Committee says, whoa, you ended this war, this is great, here's a peace prize. This is significant, though, because this also comes into this policy of Roosevelt's of trying to bring America onto the world stage. Nobody really signed treaties in America before this because America wasn't a major player. But in this case, had they signed the treaty in Asia, say in China, it might have been viewed as being biased towards the Japanese. Had they signed the treaty in Europe, it would have been viewed as being biased towards the Russians. So America made a logical place to host this treaty, and Roosevelt presents himself as the arbiter of peace. But in the process, it's going to bring America and Japan into a little bit of a conflict, because now the Japanese, if they don't get everything they want, which they don't in this treaty, are going to feel like maybe America's to blame, and maybe America wants what they want. And it's going to be one of these steps on the road that are going to lead us to Pearl Harbor and to where the United States and Japan will come into war, which is important to understand because that didn't just happen. I know it was a surprise attack, but there were a ton of things that led up to that. And that's important when we get there to understand why the Japanese are going to attack the United States and come into conflict with them. It begins really with Commodore Perry, which you already kind of looked at in the Meiji Restoration, and with this sort of series of conflicts, not wars, not direct conflicts, but competing interests, where the United States and Japan start looking for similar things. Now, that'll make a lot more sense when I get to the Spanish-American War, and the United States takes over the Philippines, which is right next door to Japan. But getting ahead of myself, let's move on from the peacemaker to the warmonger. So the other aspect of Teddy Roosevelt that makes him difficult is he's negotiating peace, he's being diplomatic, but he was a man's man, and he was a warrior. He was the Secretary of the Navy when the Spanish-American War broke out, but he builds really his presidential campaign around this almost mythical image of him as a strong warlike leader, because when the war breaks out, instead of staying in his comfortable Washington office as Secretary of the Navy, he turns in his resignation and enlists in the Army as a colonel and leads a division of troops called the Rough Riders in some battles in Cuba, where he gains a lot of fame because he leads from the front. There's a famous battle of San Juan Hill. Sorry, that's in Puerto Rico, I think. Anyway, I have to look at it. But in this war, he leads this battle. He charges up the hill ahead of his men as their colonel, leading them into battle. They take the hill. It's a dramatic moment, and Roosevelt builds his image around that. The man's man, the warrior, the one who led the troops in the charge up San Juan Hill, and he says, I will lead America on a charge into anything we need to. He is an old school leader in that way. This breed of leader is really going to die out soon because of a thing called the machine gun. Leading people into battle directly on the front becomes very foolish. I kind of mentioned in the Franco-Prussian War video, the French emperor gets captured because he's doing just that, and then they're paralyzed. But in Roosevelt's case, he's not the president at this point, so he can do it. But that's the image, that's the kind of macho man image he builds for his campaign as president. And let's look a little more closely at what he has to say. So this is one of his most famous speeches, and I'm going to read it for you because I think it tells us a lot about Roosevelt himself, and I think it's a speech that everyone should listen to and think about. I think it tells us a lot about something we can all strive for. I think this is valuable for us. So it comes from a speech called The Man in the Arena, and I think it has value for us today. So here's what Teddy Roosevelt said. He said, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better." Okay? Armchair warriors, Twitter warriors, people criticizing you online, don't listen to them. If you're trying to do something great, do it, because it's the person doing things that matters. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena. It's kind of a gladiator image. Whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. You're never going to accomplish anything, he says, if you don't try and if you don't struggle and without failing sometimes. But who does actually strive to do great deeds? Who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions? Who spends himself, who gives his life in a worthy cause? Who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Fail daring greatly. If I can encourage you to do one thing, if we can learn one thing from Teddy Roosevelt, let it be that. Fail daring greatly, okay? Don't give in to mediocrity. Don't not try because you're afraid you're going to fail. Try, and if you fail, fail spectacularly. That is how you do great things in life. That is how Teddy Roosevelt led America from being just another country to being a world power, by being willing to go out there and put himself out there and not being afraid of failure, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Better to be defeated trying than to just give up. Teddy Roosevelt. So that gives you an idea of the measure of this man. Now we're going to get into the war itself. So in this war, it is a short war. It is fought over 1 year, kind of like the Franco-Prussian War. That tells you one side is going to win, and it's not a very fair fight. It's very lopsided. And this is actually a problem because the Franco-Prussian War and the Spanish-American War and the various colonial wars that these countries have been fighting for the last 50 years, they bring Europe into a sense of false security when World War I breaks out. When World War I breaks out, everybody thinks it will be over by the end of the year because the Franco-Prussian War was over by the end of the year. The Spanish-American War was over by the end of the year. So of course this war is going to be over by the end of the year. Spoiler alert, it's not. But this war is over by the end of the year because it's completely unfair. It's completely one-sided. The United States is massively more powerful than Spain. And I'm going to get to that in these things. Spain is an old power that's collapsing. The United States is a new power that is the most powerful country in the world. Really, it's bullying the weakened Spanish Empire. Not too dissimilar from what they did with the Mexicans many years earlier in the Mexican-American War. But they're flexing their muscles in this. So how does this get started? How does this global powerhouse, the United States, wind up fighting against a weakened old colonial empire? Let's dig into that. So it begins with the destruction of the battleship Maine, and I will zoom in on this picture of the battleship Maine ruins. Basically, Spain is fighting a war against an independence movement in Cuba and an independence movement in the Philippines. Spain is weak and its colonies know it. So the countries that they are oppressing, that they have colonized, Cuba and the Philippines in particular, are rebelling against them. There's a Cuban War of Independence and a Spanish War of Independence going on. The United States has interests in Cuba. Cuba is right off the coast of the United States, and during that time, an old American battleship, the Maine, the one we just looked at, was hanging out in the harbor of Havana in Cuba, and it explodes. Nobody really knows what happened. The U.S. blames the Spanish, says they attacked our battleship that was protecting our interests. No one seems to blame the Cuban rebels, though maybe they blew it up in a way of trying to get America to join the war. And a lot of people think it might have blown up because it was old. It might have just been a boiler malfunction that blew up and the ship did. Anyway, this gives the U.S. the pretext for war, and the U.S. is looking for any excuse to take stuff from Spain because Spain is weak. And people like Teddy Roosevelt are pushing them. Let's be strong. That realpolitik, might makes right, like the Prussians took Alsace-Lorraine from France. The United States is going, we need to take stuff, and the only way to take stuff is to take it from other weak countries because Europe has run out of places to colonize. And so the United States has run out of places really to colonize. So the best way to get colonies is to take them from someone weak like Spain. So when the Maine explodes and Americans die, and the American press goes crazy, and they do this thing called yellow journalism, which is essentially the first version of fake news. They publish all these things. Remember the Maine. Spain blew up our battleship. We've got to go get them. They're very patriotic and jingoistic, which means warlike, and they really rile the American population up to feel like they're justified in attacking Spain. Probably not. This is really probably an opportunistic world power that is on the rise, taking advantage of a weakened old world power that's collapsing and stealing their colonial empire from them. But they have the pretext, so they go to war. How does the war happen? Well, the U.S. new fleet, because the Maine was an old battleship, and why would we station a new battleship there? The new battleships show up, and the Spanish ships are no match for them. The U.S. Navy crushes the Spanish Navy in Havana and in Manila in the Philippines. The U.S. then supports both rebel groups, so now Spain is fighting a rebellion in their colony and United States Marines supporting the rebels. And the Spanish, again, don't stand a chance. So we get some great artwork here illustrating this. Uncle Sam protecting the Cuban maiden from the evil Spanish men. And over here, two patriots shaking hands, an American soldier and a Cuban soldier. An interesting image if you think about the modern recent history between the United States and Cuba, but that comes later. At this point, Cuba and the United States are really good friends. So they're building a friendship because the United States is rescuing Cuba from their Spanish overlords. So U.S. Marines show up and they drive the Spanish out. The U.S. has better guns, they have newer battleships, they have more cannons, they have more of everything. This isn't like the Franco-Prussian War where there's like 2 or 3 advantages. The U.S. basically has advantages in everything. Not to mention that Cuba is way closer to the United States than it is to Spain. And even the Philippines isn't really any closer to Spain than it is to America. So America is closer, the new fleets of America go out, and they just smash the Cubans in both cases. They smash the Spanish in both cases, liberating the Cubans. You can't smash them and liberate them. Or can you? Let's go to the Philippines. Because Cuba, the United States joins forces with, and they say, be independent, be our friends. They put a bunch of businesses there, and very soon there will be a Coke bottling plant there. It's one of the first countries the U.S. sells Coke in outside the U.S. And there's this really good business relationship. All these American businesses start doing business with Cuba. That's why relationships get strained when Fidel Castro leads the communists and they take over the government. But until then, for the first 40 years or so after this, Cuba and the U.S. are best buddies, close buddies. But in the Philippines, that's not how it goes. Because the U.S. is not just interested in making friends. The U.S. is interested in taking colonies. It wants to become a colonial empire. So what they do is, in the Philippines, they help the rebels beat the Spanish, and then they turn around and kill the rebels and take the Philippines. Filipinos aren't so happy about that. The United States will hold the Philippines as a colony by force until World War II, after which the Philippines will finally gain its independence again. So the Philippine War of Independence is not so successful as the Spanish one, because the Philippines will just become a colony of America, which will post military bases and things there, exerting their influence in Asia, which, like I alluded at the beginning, is going to make Japan really nervous, because now there's not the colony of an old colonial power next to them. There's the colony of a rising new power exerting its influence in Asia right next to their border with the United States, and that makes Japan view the United States as a rival, not as a friend. This rivalry is going to build over this time, and again, that's where Pearl Harbor comes from. It's the outpouring of a rivalry that eventually comes to head in conflict, because the Japanese eventually see that it's inevitable that they're going to wind up actually fighting the United States, and they decide they want to strike the first attack. But we'll get to that next year when we talk about World War II. So the U.S. takes the Philippines, they drive out the rebels and take it over. They take Guam, still an American territory today, not a state, but still American. They take Puerto Rico, still an American territory today, not a state. Territory, that means colony. That's the American code word for colony, overseas territories. So again, Puerto Ricans are Americans, but they can't vote. Very American, but we haven't decided to add an extra state. It's complicated. It hasn't happened, unfortunately. Maybe one day they will be incorporated more fully in the Union. That would be pretty awesome, but who knows? That's up to the government. And so we have these colonies the United States takes, the Philippines as well, though they'll lose that one in World War II, which many of them they hold even today from this war. This is really the U.S. building their overseas territorial empire. It establishes military bases that they are going to use throughout the world wars to exert influence, especially in the Pacific in their campaign against the Japanese later. So the Japanese aren't wrong to be concerned about this. Now, if they'd avoided war, then they wouldn't be. But there's a reason that they see this as a strategic threat to them. This also cements the legacy of Teddy Roosevelt with great posters like this, charging up San Juan Hill, whether he actually led the charge that way or not. That is certainly the image he cultivates. Leading the men gloriously into battle. Sorry, that was just too good for me to pass up. So let's dig in a bit more. What is the aftermath of this? It's the rise of the United States. The United States is established as a colonial and imperial power, as an industrial power, and as one of the major countries in the world. Spain, which had been a major power for hundreds of years in the colonial era, the age of exploration, was completely humbled, and it never really recovers. Spain doesn't recover as a world power. It becomes a weakened lesser power from this point on. Teddy Roosevelt becomes a national hero, and that boosts his campaign to then become president. He's going to become so popular that he's president, and then years later, he doesn't like what his successor does. So after stepping down from the office, he runs again 4 years later and makes his own political party, the Bull Moose Party, as evidenced by the bull moose head in this image, and makes claims like, I'm fit as a bull moose, and is running for re-election, and he's so popular he gets more votes in that election than the Republican Party. There were two parties, Republicans and Democrats. Teddy Roosevelt said, I'm making my own party, Bull Moose. He beats the Republican candidate, but that actually results in the Democrat candidate, Woodrow Wilson, taking the presidency. Now, had Roosevelt not split the vote, or had he managed to run as the Republican candidate and won the election, that might have had major impacts on World War I, on how it took place. His form of diplomacy might have been in charge, and America might have been more assertive at the early days of the war, which maybe would have prevented the war. Or maybe they would have entered the war sooner. Or maybe not. That's history. It's hard to tell what could have happened. But in either case, his splitting the Republican ticket let the Democrat Woodrow Wilson run, and he largely gets into office claiming to keep the United States out of the war, establishing America as a more neutral and isolationist power again. He pushes back away from this expansionism. So Roosevelt brings the U.S. into power, and then, in a way, his actions lead to it withdrawing from the national stage to some extent under Woodrow Wilson, which, again, we'll kind of get to that later when we get to World War I, and you can see the impacts of that. But it's always worth thinking, what could have been? So what does he do as president? What examples do we have of his policy? Well, I want to give this example because it's maybe the best one. In 1907, he's going to send a fleet of 16 modern battleships around the world on a tour. This is the epitome of his foreign policy. This first of all, look at this picture. This was the flagship of that fleet. This really is a modern battleship. Okay, this is 1907, and this ship would not look out of place in World War II. This is not an old ship. This is brand new, state-of-the-art technology. It's large, it's sophisticated, it's steel-plated, it's got tons of guns, but it's painted white. And this is what's going to be called the Great White Fleet. He paints them all white and sends them out, and it's decked out with flags of foreign nations. Because what this is a show of force and a goodwill tour. So he sends this fleet of 16 battleships like this throughout the world, and they sail into harbors like London or Tokyo or Hong Kong. And here comes this glistening squadron of 16 American battleships, but they're not attacking. That's why they're painted white and they have these flags. Otherwise, people would have been freaking out that their whole city was going to get wrecked. This is a serious show of force. They're not attacking. They're just showing the world, America is here. We have a fleet. We have an impressive fleet of 16 modern battleships. So, be our friends. Trade with us. Let us sell you our goods. Let us buy your goods. And if you don't, remember, we have 16 modern battleships, and we can make you pay. This is the epitome of Roosevelt's speak softly and carry a big stick diplomacy strategy. The idea being, I will be your friend, I'll offer my hand of friendship, but if you don't take it, in my other hand, I have a big stick I can beat you with. And that big stick in this case is the Great White Fleet. The problem with this is that it leads to, oh, we're not getting to that story yet. The problem with this is that it leads to escalation. Again, all of this needs to be connected to World War I because that's where it's going. And once the United States shows off this new fleet, other countries are going to feel threatened. So England, whose security depends on the strength of the Royal Navy, knows they need to have more ships than the United States. If the US has 16 battleships, we need 20 battleships. And Germany, who wants to become a naval power, even though they haven't been, says, ooh, England's building 20 battleships. We need 22 battleships. And Japan, who again feels like America's a rival in Asia, needs 20 battleships as well. And China needs battleships because America has battleships and Japan has battleships. Well, China better have battleships. So everybody embarks on this, and not just because of the Great White Fleet, but it's an example of what's going on. And this massive buildup of new battleships and new cannons and new weapons, because the Franco-Prussian War told them if they don't have steel cannons, they're doomed. So they need fancy steel cannons and tons of them because artillery is important and battleships are important. And they need all these weapons. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, we've invented this cool thing called the machine gun. And so everybody needs machine guns. And that means that by the time World War I gets there, everybody thinks it's going to be a short war because they saw the American fleet obliterate the Spanish fleet. They saw the German army smash the French army. But everybody's learned the lessons of these wars and the lessons of the Russo-Japanese War and the use of these new technology. And nobody's sitting around without it this time. It's not going to be a case where one country has total superiority over the other because everybody's got all these weapons in amounts that have never before been seen. This industrial buildup of weapons that's going to lead to the greatest calamity in war the world has ever seen, because nobody's really thinking about the fact that if we all have more guns and we all have more weapons, that just means we can kill more people. That just means we can do more damage. So, again, speak softly and carry a big stick works great in terms of the U.S.'s diplomacy and the U.S. expanding itself. But the arms buildup that accompanies all of this, especially with these wars where countries are dominating other countries, and everybody wants to make sure they're not the country that's going to get dominated in the next war, is going to make the world a much more dangerous place as we get to the world wars in the 20th century. So, one last fun story about Teddy Roosevelt. Oh, no, don't go away. I want to zoom in. This is from the Smithsonian. 50 Cent got shot while on stage and still whines about it. Teddy Roosevelt got shot mid-speech and didn't leave the stage until he finished. True story. He was giving a political speech, and he gets up there and starts giving his speech, and an assassin who wants him dead because he's a macho man, he's a controversial figure, gets up and shoots him. The bullet hit his speech. It was wrapped up in his pocket. Thick, big speech. You're giving a big speech, hour, 2 hours long. That's a long piece of paper. Went through his speech, hurt him. He started bleeding, so he pulls out the bloody speech and says, oh, I'm sorry, I can't read my speech. I was just shot. Continues giving his speech from memory for the next half an hour, and finishes his speech before he goes to the hospital. I can't imagine any modern politician doing that. Okay, if I got shot in the middle of class, I'm sorry. I'm not finishing class. I'm going to the hospital right away. I don't know how I would get shot in the middle of class. Please don't shoot me. But that is a man's man. That is a hard man. That is a man who's not going to back down. And this, again, macho-ness is inspiring and cool, but when you get a bunch of macho guys like Bismarck and Teddy Roosevelt all together with giant armies with hundreds of thousands of cannons and tons of battleships, it's a recipe for disaster because nobody's going to back down. You need the diplomatic side too. So, anyway, that's just a fun story anecdote. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson on the Spanish-American War. I hope you understand how these conflicts are building together to get us to World War I and World War II, that World War I and World War II are not isolated incidents, but that understanding the context helps us understand why they happened, which side people were on, and why they were so destructive. And that hopefully when we get to Pearl Harbor again, things like this will start to piece in your eye. And unlike me, who really didn't get it until I was in college, you'll understand that there's a reason the Japanese fought America and attacked Pearl Harbor. So, I didn't get it. I grew up not really understanding why, but they attacked us. They were bad. There are reasons these things happen, and understanding them helps us to put context and helps us to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. Anyway, have a great day. If you have any questions, bring them to our Zoom meeting, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.